May a multitude of camels cover you. I don't even know what that means. I'm assuming it's like abundance and all of that, but we hear not only about a multitude of camels from the prophet Isaiah, but we hear these words: "Arise and shine, for your light has come." And even though these words were written and spoken thousands of years ago, they still ring out across centuries. There's a promise in them that the light will break into the darkness, and hopefully the nations will stream towards the brightness of God's grace. It's a vision that Isaiah is casting, painting almost, of a world made right, of glory revealed, and God's presence illuminating everything, and even rulers of nations see it and behave accordingly. But then we have this passage from Matthew, where Matthew shows us what it looks like when people see clearly, when what has been darkened has become enlightened. And it happens not in a temple, and not in the halls of power, not where there's priests and scholars, not in a palace. This light of God, this enlightenment moment happens in a Bethlehem stable. And the very first people to see it are not priests, they're not rulers or kings, they're foreigners. They're outsiders. Magi from the east, probably Persian astrologers, even though we don't truly know. But they're people by the standards of the day, by every measure that mattered, shouldn't have been the one who recognized Messiah, right? They came from afar. They weren't of the faith. And yet they came, and I like to think that they came and discovered and were enlightened, gained wisdom, because they were curious. Not because there was anything special about them, other than they were curious. That they saw something in the sky, they saw something that was not what they expected. Something unusual, something that didn't fit their charts. And rather than explaining it away or just ignoring it, they asked, "What does this mean?" And then they followed that question. And I love that. I love that curiosity. And it's something I think sometimes we lose track of as we get older. We stop being curious. Because what would happen in our lives, what would happen in our churches if we asked that question without worry, without fear, knowing that God is with us as we explored it? What does it mean? As we look at the religious landscape of Washington State, and not that many people go to church, what does it mean that not that many people go to church? As we look around, and this church has gotten younger, thank you, Sophia. And Andy, thank you, Andy, Mara, no. But what does it mean when our churches are largely a little bit older? It's not a pathology. It's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. But what does it mean? Sometimes I think we're afraid to ask that question. How many people have seen Ted Lasso? Okay, a lot of you. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It is a beautiful series. It's on Apple TV. You can subscribe to Apple TV, watch it, and then unsubscribe if you want to. But it's a beautiful, beautiful show. And it's got a line in it, and some of you know where I'm going, that's become kind of a cultural touchstone, where Ted says in this one moment that I could explain if I had about 3 hours, he says, "Be curious, not judgmental." And when the show came out and that line was spoken, you started to see it pop up on social media and on graffiti, and some very brave souls tattooed it on themselves, not me, but be curious, not judgmental. The Magi and Ted Lasso have this in common. Pardon? Oh. And we see that might be the mark of wisdom. being curious rather than judging so quickly. Notice that the Magi didn't have all the answers. They were scholars, they were learned, but they started their journey with a question, not certainty. Because if we start a journey with certainty, we're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to learn anything. But if we start with a question, what does this mean? What will we discover? It means that they were willing to learn or be wrong or adjust. And that's powerful. That's amazing. So wisdom, amazingly, turns out, isn't about having everything figured out, right? Isn't that strange? If you ask a child, what does it mean to be wise? They would probably say something like, well, it's when you know a lot of things. But as I've gotten older, and I suspect a lot of you have discovered this, real wisdom is just being honest about how much you don't know. And then trying to stay curious about all that we don't know. Wisdom is being curious enough to follow the questions, to follow something that catches your attention, to follow when we ask that brave question, what does this mean? Even when you don't know where it's leading, right? So they set out. They see this thing in the sky that doesn't fit. They ask, what does it mean? And they set out. And naturally, the first place they went was to Jerusalem, because where else would you look for a king but the seat of power, the capital? And they go there and they don't find what they're looking for. God wasn't there. The source of the light wasn't there. And instead they found Herod, who might be the opposite of a source of light. A king so threatened by a rival that he's willing to slaughter children to make sure that eventually there's not a threat to his power. So the Magi went there and said, nope, that's not the source of light. They were surrounded by religious scholars who could quote scripture. And he looked at them and said, nope, they're not the source of light either. And there's a little pause in here. I had this sermon all written, and then I made the mistake of looking at the news. And then I was like, well, how on earth does the bombing of Venezuela and all of that tie into this? And interestingly, it does. Magi are presented in our sacred text as people with wisdom, right? They're on a journey. They're willing to ask questions. But they were wise in another way, and they were wise in that they saw a tyrant when they saw one. They recognized a tyrant when they saw it. They understood worldly power that's built on violence and fear, and they were wise enough to not collaborate with them. And they were wise enough when they had a chance to go home by a different way, right? They didn't go back in the direction of the tyrant. They went home another way. I think that's important. But before they went home by another way, they had to adjust their plans. And I think that's another piece of being wise. The star led them not to the palace, but actually away from the palace and towards a small village. And then they found themselves standing not in a throne room that was as big as this sanctuary, but in front of a house or a stable. And there's a young child and parents there. And somehow, God's gift to them, they recognized what was in front of them. They knelt, they offered gifts, they worshiped. And so I think that might be another piece of wisdom. And that's holding plans loosely. Being responsive when God shows up differently than we expect. And God really seems to enjoy showing up differently than we expect, right? We like to think that we can dictate where God's going to be in any situation and what God should look like And then God shows up in a stable or in a feeding trough or in a burning bush, in the arms of a teenage mother, in the care of a carpenter. The Magi were wise enough to hold their plans loosely, to not allow their preconceived notions to box them in so that they were blind and trapped. They were wise enough to go, oh, how about that? God is there. I think one of the interesting things that's happened over the past couple years, if Steve Pollard were here, he wouldn't call it interesting. He would probably call it infuriating, is that as these two congregations have merged and as we've gone down the road of building affordable housing, there has been so many of our plans that have changed, right? Those who've been on leadership, those who've been a part of this all along, you know that to be the case. And there were times Steve and I had plenty of conversations about, Steve would be like, we need a 5-year plan. and I would be like, I would love to give you a 5-year plan, but I'm afraid it would be fictional. And it would make you feel better. And I'm not picking on Steve because he's not here. Or maybe I am picking on Steve because he's not here and he can't defend himself. But Steve is, like many people in this area, an engineer. And I've never lived somewhere that's full of engineers before. It's interesting. Because engineers, I've come to discover, they like blueprints. And they like schedules. And they like to know who's doing what and when. And that's what you want out of an engineer. If you have somebody who's building your house, you want them to be like, this happens in this way on this day to these criteria, because it's what makes a good engineer. And I think it was frustrating to Steve and me that all of this beautiful mess that is merging and building affordable housing and all of that, it would not adhere to any sort of schedule or plan. And so in the middle of that, as I turned gray, I finally had to kind of start going like, okay, we can plan for the next week or month or maybe 3 months. But then we sort of have to let go, just like the wisdom that you shared with us. In some ways, we just have to be like, okay, God, let's see what happens. And we'll respond to what we discover, rather than trying to say, it's going to look like this in 3 years. Sometimes we try to do that with our lives too, don't we? It makes us feel better. We sit down when we get really motivated on a Sunday afternoon and we map it out. Has anyone here ever had your map actually lead you to where you thought you were going to be? Of course not. Because life happens, because God happens. Accidents happen, blessings happen, surprises happen. There's a wisdom in holding our plans loose enough that God can kind of work God's way in there and nudge things in a good direction. The third thing, maybe the fourth thing, if we include knowing a tyrant when we see one as wisdom, which we probably should. After they encountered Christ, these wise people went home a different way. Yes, in a dream they were warned not to return to Herod, but there's something deeper at play. Because the Bible is full of symbolism and poetry and all of that. I think that we're told they went home by another way because they couldn't go back the same way, because they weren't the same people anymore. They started off the journey by being curious, and being curious led them to see a tyrant for a tyrant, and it led them to see that God is full of surprises and seems to even delight in surprising us when we make our plans. And so they couldn't go back the same way because they were different people. Real wisdom is transformative. It changes us. So as we begin this new year, or 4 days into a new year, my questions. Where is God inviting you? And where is God inviting us to be curious rather than certain? I was talking with a friend yesterday who will be up here, I think, in February. He's a filmmaker. He's one of those annoyingly accomplished, talented people where it's just like, "Oh, really?" One of those people, he can play any instrument. He's an award-winning filmmaker. He shifted from reggae into classical music, which is a very strange transition to make. Goes over to Europe and performs with orchestras. I think is going to be writing a children's book soon, and he's just, if I didn't like him, I would not like him at all. And I don't know why he's friends with me. I keep like, little old me. But Antonio is his name, and he's going to be up here, and he has this kind of, it's almost like a one-man show, but it's not really a show. He performs some music, and it's all about curiosity, and he shares stories about how curiosity transformed his life, because he had very humble beginnings, and he was one of those, he was like a streetcar racer. Like he has this wildlife journey. And he was telling me a little bit about this presentation, and he's willing to come up here. And he was saying that one of the big pieces that he discovered that has really helped transform him is not just being curious about the world and other people that don't look like us and all of that, but curious about what is happening in his own heart. Why does he respond with anger when he encounters a certain thing? And so, for this new year, where is God inviting us to be curious? Not just outwardly, but inwardly. What questions might we need to follow? And what plans might we be holding too tightly? Where is God asking us and giving us the opportunity to respond rather than just saying, we're going that way in that pace to get to that place? And what might it look like for us to go home by another road, to allow ourselves to be changed when we encounter Christ? When we encounter Christ in this sacred worship moment, but when we encounter Christ in each other, or in those little moments of enlightenment where our minds and souls say, aha. Epiphany is the one Sunday a year where we get to really talk about wisdom. And I think today we're reminded that real wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's being curious enough to follow the questions, flexible enough to respond when God surprises us, brave enough to let the encounter change us, and clear-eyed enough to recognize sin when we see it and to run from it. So arise, shine, O people, your light has come. And the light is still breaking into the darkness. That star is still shining. The invitation is still being offered. Will we be wise enough to follow? In God's grace, may it be so. And amen. Okay. Speaking of being open and curious, we're going to learn a new hymn, right? It is called Come Light Our Hearts,